Thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you again for part 2 of our Jonah series. And, what happened in chapter 1? We noticed that Jonah is on his way down, isn't he? God tells him to arise, go and call out. Very clear instructions. And Jonah gets up, but then he flees and begins his descent down to the underworld. He goes down to Joppa, down into a ship, down into the bottom of the ship, where he lies down and falls into a death-like sleep. And the pagan sailors wake him up, and the captain even echoes the instruction of God, arise, call out to your God. Jonah does not. But on questioning, Jonah can parrot a statement of faith, if you remember. I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. But his heart is not in that statement of faith. It's a learned pattern of performative behavior, and down he goes, further still, down into a death wish even. And albeit reluctantly, the sailors grant that wish. They become worshippers of Yahweh in the process. But for Jonah, it is not looking good as they throw him overboard. Down one more time, even into the depths of the sea. And so our text for today begins. Chapter 1, verse 17, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And the question really, I think the narrator wants us to answer at this point is, what do you expect to happen? If you are in the sea and you get swallowed by a big sea monster, it's not good news, is it? It's not good news. Secondly, there's something else we might notice here before we get into Jonah's prayer, which is where we're going to spend most of our time. Secondly, look at this phrase, Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. That sounds significant, doesn't it? If you know anything about the story of the Bible, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. But surprise, surprise, that doesn't finish Jonah off. But rather, chapter 2, verse 1, then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish. So he hasn't died. In fact, he's praying. It's a bit of a twist in the story. Jonah doesn't end at the end of chapter 1 with Jonah coming to the end of his days in the belly of a fish, as we might imagine on first reading. He ends up praying from the belly of this fish. And then one more thing to point out in these introductory 2 verses before we get into the poem itself, the prayer itself. The word fish here is slightly different the third time to what it is the first 2 times. The first 2 times, it's in the masculine form of the noun in the Hebrew. The fish is masculine, male. The third time, it's in the feminine form of the noun. What do you think that means? So he gets swallowed by the fish, masculine. He's in the belly of the fish, masculine, for 3 days, 3 nights. But then he prays to the Lord his God from the fish, feminine. And it won't surprise you, this is a feature of Hebrew language, like in French, where you have some words that are masculine and feminine, it's that sort of thing. I'm reliably informed. And it won't surprise you to hear that that word belly is kind of contested as to how you render that. It could also be taken as womb. So Jonah's praying perhaps from the womb of the fish, perhaps rather than, as we might expect, being a daddy fish's dinner, Jonah is now a mother fish's baby. Very interesting, rich imagery, isn't it, as we come into this prayer that Jonah prays from the belly of the fish. Now, let me read for you the prayer itself. Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And then I don't think I've put it on the slide there, but the chapter ends with this statement, back to narrative. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. So we've got this very, very strange situation in Jonah, very much in keeping with a strange book, whereby just at the moment where we think it's all over for Jonah, he's perhaps experiencing a very transformative situation. A vehicle of certain death seems to be becoming a means to newness of life. What does that remind you of? There are all kinds of complexities and tensions with this prayer, things that we might raise an eyebrow at, especially when we read it in the context of the whole book. And we'll get to those tensions in the context of the whole book towards the end. What I'd like to do as we give our attention to this prayer is to ask 4 questions. First of all, what is this experience like that Jonah reflects back on in his prayer? What's the experience like that he's reflecting on in this prayer? Well, first of all, verse 2, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. The belly of Sheol, this is the place of the dead, the underworld, a deathly place to pass through. What is his experience like? It's like a journey into the underworld, the place of the dead. It's as if he's being buried alive right now. Condition that 1 or 2 of us might find ourselves in this morning. I don't know if you've come across this film franchise, the 28-something later franchise. It's a horror movie. This was the sequel. 28 Days Later was the first one. You might have heard of that. I haven't seen it, or this one, so I can neither vouch for it nor otherwise. But what's interesting, the reason I bring it up is because the Jonah Centre where I work is just near the village of Redmire, and they shot a lot of this film at Redmire last year, or the year before, 2024 I think it was, 2024. Danny Boyle's latest horror movie. It's not strictly a zombie movie because the baddies in this film are called the Infected, and the story is that they were kind of infected with a virus, the rage virus. And it's kind of left them in this suspended state between life and death, just like Jonah. And they built all these fake kind of skull towers just in some farmer's field near Redmire. It's quite funny, really. And if you were a local resident, you could go and look around the film set. And here's one of the local residents of Redmire having a look around. Obviously, that's a joke at the expense of my work neighbours. But this was an experience of what it might be like living in the valley of the shadow of death. This is Jonah's experience going down to Sheol, the place of the dead. And I might put it to you that Jonah is similarly blessed as we were in Redmire, with the opportunity to experience the place of the dead while still living. Perhaps so that he can stop living as if he's already dead. What else is this experience like for Jonah? Well, verse 3, you cast me into the deep, he says, into the heart of the seas. And the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. So this experience that Jonah's reflecting on was like being thrown into a flood, the water coming down on him, like Pharaoh's army being pursuing the Hebrews out of Egypt. And you remember that the waters came back over them. This is a picture of God's judgment coming down, reaping what you sowed, suffering the consequences of your sin, being under judgment, sitting in the path of the wrath of God, in the heart of the seas, surrounded by the flood, God's waves and billows passing over you. What else is this experience like? Can you take a bit more? Verse 4, then I said, I am driven away from your sight. I am driven away from your sight. That's an interesting one. It could be I am banished from your presence. Now, if you remember chapter 1, Jonah wanted to flee the presence of God, didn't he? That's what he was trying to do. He wanted to get away from the presence of God. Now he's experiencing a circumstance that is actually like being banished from the presence of God. And it's not quite, all that. It's not quite the solution to the problem that he thought it might be. We could equate this language of God's sight with our experience of human conscience even. When you ignore your conscience, you wound your conscience, and you become a kind of distorted facsimile of a human, made in the image of God, and then wanting to run away from that, wanting to rebel against that image, and then finding yourself mourning the way that you've distorted that image, as it were. I want to get away from God's presence. Okay, I'm doing what needs to be done to be free of that, at least in my experience, as I think I can do that, and then I find myself banished, as it were, from the presence of God, and it's not very pleasant. What else is this experience like? Verse 5, it's like being surrounded by water again. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me, and here's another fresh idea, picture. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. What gets wrapped up in Bible times? What gets wrapped up? When do you wrap up somebody's head? Only in a very particular circumstance, right? We tend to do it with chemicals these days. We embalm. They would wrap up. They would wrap up. So Jonah is surrounded by water again with a kind of weed-like grave cloth arrangement. Weeds as grave clothes at the roots of the mountains. This is not a shallow grave that Jonah is experiencing, but the deepest a grave can be. You can't go any further down than the roots of the mountains in this picture language. It's the foundations of the earth itself, you could say. As far away from God's temple as you can be, because God's temple in this cosmology would be on the top of the highest mountain. And Jonah is at the roots of the mountains. You still with me? There's a little bit more. Verse 6, what is this experience like? It's like being trapped. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Bars closing upon you forever. Imprisoned with a very, very long sentence. And finally, verse 7, it's like life fainting away from you. My life was fainting away or ebbing away. This is the life, this is the experience of T.S. Eliot's hollow men, for whom the world does not end with a bang, but with a whimper. Can you relate to any of this at the moment? I mean, surely it's not as bad as Jonah's experience. I do hope it's not, brother or sister. I'm very sorry if it is. But I'm glad it gets this bad for Jonah. I'm glad it gets this bad for Jonah for our sake. I'm glad this kind of experience is in the scriptures. And maybe, at least to some extent, you've had seasons or are having a season in life a bit like this. Maybe we can go through seasons as the church, in a broad sense, that are a bit like this. The church in exile. This is an exilic experience that Jonah is having when you kind of think about it from a representation of Israel point of view. It's strangely morose and morbid, distant from God, wounded in conscience, trapped and helpless with little motivation in life. Well done. That's the tough bit. Okay. A second question. We've thought about what this experience is like for Jonah that he's recounting. Now, what's God doing in all of this? Where's God in all of this? Well, chapter 1, it was God who started all this thing going for Jonah, didn't he? Because it was the Lord who hurled a great wind upon the sea, having given Jonah this instruction, and then Jonah rebels, ignores, and then God hurls this great wind upon the sea. And then the lot of the sailors, it fell on Jonah, didn't it? The lot of the sailors. How did that happen? Was that just a bit of chance? And then it was the Lord who appointed the big fish to swallow Jonah. What do you make of that? What's God up to? And what's interesting is that Jonah, in his prayer here, his prayer of thanksgiving for being rescued, he recognizes God's hand in all of this. So verse 3, you cast me into the deep. You cast me into the deep. Does that sound strange to you? Who cast Jonah into the deep? It was the sailors, wasn't it? And he asked to be cast into the deep. And yet Jonah, from this position of celebrating the rescue of God, says, you cast me into the deep. We're surprised perhaps that there isn't greater ownership here. Sorry God for running away. Maybe a bit of repentance. But Jonah is nevertheless seemingly able to recognize God's sovereignty over his sin as part of his celebration of being rescued. That's kind of how the apostles preached the cross, by the way. The most heinous sin in the history of the world, the brutal murder of the Son of God, just as God planned it. The apostles are able to recognize God in the worst of evil circumstances. So, God is directing the drama. What else is God doing in this situation? Well, he's listening and he's rescuing. So God is directing, listening, and rescuing. Verse 2, you heard my voice. God hears Jonah's prayer. Verse 7, my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Prayer operates in the same geography, along the same dimensions as the conscience and the presence of God. It's not necessarily saying that Jonah's praying verbally out loud and that God's hearing it with ears. It's not that sort of picture, but it's that God knows what's going on for Jonah. God knows Jonah's heart. God hears Jonah's prayer from the belly of the beast. He knows what's going on for us this morning. He hears our hearts. He's attuned to our prayers. Prayers that are maybe just a fleeting thought. Prayers that are maybe just a disposition, a discomfort of heart. And thirdly, God is rescuing. Verse 6, you brought up my life from the pit. So after all of this going down, 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 now it's God who is the one who brings up. And verse 8, there is steadfast love. There is steadfast love in the one true God. Verse 9, a key Old Testament declaration from Psalm 3 and elsewhere. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So where is God in all of this? What is God doing? He's directing, he's hearing, and he's rescuing. Which begs the question, at least to me, if God's behind it all in the first place, why take Jonah on this journey at all? What do you think about that? Why take Jonah on this journey at all? And how does this God, the real God, who cares about your life, but is very much outside of your control, how does he sit with you at the moment? A third question: what's Jonah's part in all of this? So we've thought about the experience, what it's like that Jonah reflects on, what he's been through. We've thought about God's hand in it all, so to speak, what God is up to. And now, what's Jonah's part in all of this? Well, let's notice what Jonah does, because I think there is wisdom in this that we can learn from. Verse 2, I called out to the Lord out of my distress. Brothers, sisters, never, never, never think that a time of distress is a time to stop praying. It's probably the time to start praying, isn't it? Verse 4, then I said, this is to God, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. Speaking to God, praying to God. Verse 7, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you. What does Jonah do? What's his part in this rescue? He remembers the Lord and he prays. He remembers the Lord and he prays. He remembers the Lord and he prays. Even when you find yourself, perhaps especially when you find yourself suspended between life and death, having taken a journey down into the underworld, remember the Lord and pray. And in doing so, you won't be paying regard to vain idols. You won't be forsaking your hope of steadfast love. Verse 8, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. This is what Jonah has seemingly avoided by remembering the Lord and praying to the one true God. To remember the Lord and pray is to invest whatever pennies of hope you have left, whatever pennies of faith you have left in the Lord at the moment that it matters the most. And this seems to matter to God. He hears, he responds. It seems to make a difference. It seems to make a difference, doesn't it? So, 3 questions. Is that what this prayer has to teach us this morning? Is that what this prayer has to teach us? I don't think it's less than that. But perhaps it's more, because a 4th and final question could be, how does this prayer fit with the rest of the story? How does this prayer fit with the rest of the story? And you might say to me, Seb, and I'd have a lot of sympathy if you did, it doesn't. It doesn't fit at all. In my distress, I called to you, Jonah says. Well, you took your time, didn't you? The whole first chapter of Jonah is people trying to get Jonah to call on the Lord, and he doesn't. You cast me into the deep. We've already thought about that one. Well, you asked to be thrown overboard, Jonah, didn't you? I'm driven away from your presence. Well, who was driving? Who was driving? You ran away, or at least tried to. You ran away, or at least tried to, from the presence of the Lord. I remembered the Lord. Well, I suppose better late than never. And then this is just like, the icing on the cake, isn't it? Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving. It's like, oh, come on, mate. Come on. It was the sailors. It was the sailors who called out to the Lord. And they were the ones who made sacrifices and vows to the Lord, while you were in the middle of a death wish. And that's just reading this prayer in the light of chapter 1, the story so far. We also had a quick look at chapter 3 and 4 last week, and we'll come back to those next week. Because in the light of how Jonah acts after this experience in the fish, this prayer doesn't get any easier. I think it's legitimate, friends, after not a little research and wrestling with this, I think it's legitimate to take this prayer as both an example of how to suffer well and how to respond to finding oneself in the belly of the beast. But I also think we need to recognize the ambiguity and complexity of this prayer. and to allow the narrator of this story to unsettle us a little bit with who it seems to present Jonah to be. Much of the prayer doesn't seem to fit with the rest of the story, and it seems to show up Jonah as rather out of touch with the reality of his situation and no better than he was whilst running away from God. Just as delusional in celebrating God's rescue as he was in ignoring God's instruction. I've really enjoyed the Bible Project Classroom series through Jonah with Tim Mackey. And he shares from one scholar who is not buying this prayer of Jonah at all. So let me read what John Holbert says. In the context of chapter 1 and the remainder of the book, the prayer can only be seen as another inappropriate, hypocritical, pious-sounding affirmation, like chapter 1 verse 9 before it, and chapter 4 verse 2 after it, that we'll look at next week. By this prayer, Jonah shows the reader more clearly his true colours. His phrases sound good and right, but in the event they turn out to be empty. The negative character portrayal of Jonah in chapter 1 is sharpened in chapter 2, as he is further and further separated from those around him by his appalling behaviour. This separation is not complete until the book's end, where Jonah is in fact physically separated from everyone. So some scholars, like John Holbert, are not buying this prayer at all, and they consign the whole lot to hypocritical nonsense. But there are some others, and I have a great deal of sympathy with them, friends. Tim Mackey also points us to some who wrestle with this, because I do just wonder if this is a bit too neat a way to read this. There are those who wrestle, who try to kind of reconcile the two Jonahs, as it were. And one of those scholars is Gerhard von Rad, who, as well as having a brilliant name, says, these two Jonah figures, the rebel of chapters 1, 3, and 4, and the grateful of chapter 2, do not simply separate into two. It is quite possible that the righteous one enters into the disobedient one and lends him his voice. And when such thanksgiving, strange though it be, comes from lips that are otherwise impious, even when that praise is seriously contradicted by the life of the person in question who does not perhaps really understand at all what he is saying, there the Son of Divine Comfort does shine, even though behind clouds. Now, it's lovely language, isn't it? What is von Rad saying? What is Jonah demonstrating for us here? Perhaps something that is in fact the case for every single one of us. That even at our best, even at our most grateful, even at our most exuberant, heartfelt moments of praise for God's rescue, we don't really have a clue what we're talking about, do we? Is Jonah sincere or hypocritical in this prayer? The problem is he's probably both, just like you and me. And God, the good news, seems to be able to handle that. I think all of our praise songs must sound to God a bit like Jonah's prayer sounds to us. But God seems to be okay with that. He seems to be able to fold that into both his loving, kind, gracious commitment to Jonah, who never gives up on this guy, and also his sovereign, providential purposes for his mission in the world. And we don't get out of this mess by trying to, be perfect, trying to make something happen, do God a favor, perfect the church. We get out of this mess God's way, even if that means sitting on a beach covered in sick. And we just kind of have to come to terms with that, don't we? Our relationship with God is not mediated by the purity, sincerity, intelligence, or exuberance of our response to his rescue. Our relationship to God is mediated God by another vehicle of death that became a passing place into newness of life. As I've reflected on this prayer over the last few weeks, the juxtaposition between Jonah's words and his actions, the seeming delusion of both his rebellion and his prayer of thanksgiving, God's commitment to him in both cases, I've come to wonder if a good response to this for us is the bridge lyric of that famous Tim Hughes song, Here I Am to Worship. I'll never know how much it cost to see my sin upon that cross. And God bless you. Amen.